Perfect. Well, thank you so much for attending today's webinar, Beyond the Bottom Line, How Companies Are Integrating ESG. My name is Julie Hancher, and I am co-founder of Green Philly. We are a media company that connects people to sustainable solutions through our digital resources and events like these. So we host panels, thought leadership, and interviews with local experts, as well as Sustain PHL, which is our annual awards, which is returning next month on October 20th. So that's also another exciting event we have coming up soon. So with Green Philly, we talk a lot about various sustainability topics, everything from how to recycle to climate and what local companies are doing. And I'm sure most, if not everyone on this call, is aware there have been some very exciting conversations happening locally and nationally, both with the Inflation Reduction Act that was just passed, and also having a huge step forward with some climate goals. But beyond government and, legislation that might be coming through, we also have parties that need to act on climate. So part of Green Philly's mission is we're trying to figure out or share how individuals, businesses, nonprofits, and civic government, et cetera, all those parties are coming together to all focus on climate solutions. And businesses need to play an important role of that, right? So today I'm very excited to talk to 3 experts about how companies are talking and thinking about environmental goals, how maybe they can combat some of the issues they have had previously. I was gonna say, I think before a few years ago, I interviewed Wegmans and they were saying how, Wegmans was going on the zero waste mission. And they were like, if one Wegmans store implements zero waste, that's like 20 to 40,000 people a week that are coming in making this change versus one person who is maybe implementing something on their own. So in simple words, ESG is basically using environmental, social, and governance factors to evaluate companies on how far advanced they are with sustainability. And we are going to hear from these 3 experts about what's happening inside the companies, how that's related to investments in these companies, and other very exciting topics. So I'm happy to introduce first Kara Oldhauser, who is the Director of Sustainability at Amtrak. With a start in interior design, her decades plus of professional experience in sustainability and public, private, and social sector roles positioned her to tackle Amtrak's diverse sustainability and climate adaptation opportunities. Welcome, Kara.
Thank you.
Next, we have Brad Malatsky, who is a partner of Duane Morris LLP, practicing in the area of real estate law. He serves the team as a lead for the Duane Morris Product Development P3 Industry Group and is co-head of the firm's Opportunity Zones practice group. He also has deep experience in environmental, social governance, public policy issues, and so much more as an expert too, talking about ESG all the time, and also just great in the sustainability community. So welcome, Brad.
Thanks, Jules. Good to see you and good to meet everybody else.
Thanks for joining us. Great to see you. And we also have Leslie Samlerich, who is president of Green Century Capital Management, which has experienced unprecedented growth under her leadership since 2012. Ms. Samlerich has over 25 years of experience in corporate engagement and environmental, really like this in your bio too, about including greenwashing and public health advocacy and so much more. So welcome, Leslie.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be with everyone today.
Yes, and I'm excited to see your background's Boston, right?
Yeah, I'm calling in from Boston.
Yeah, so still, this is happening across the nation. I'm very excited for the Northeast Corridor to hear how these conversations are coming in. So without further ado, I'd love to kick it off to the panelists and ask, what is ESG? I mean, I just gave a quick definition, but what does it mean to your company and your role? So Kara, do you want to kick it off? Oh, I think you have to be unmuted.
Thank you.
Of course.
I was trying to avoid some background noise. At Amtrak, for those of you maybe not familiar with all of the details of how the company was incorporated, we are Congress's for-profit corporation. We are the only for-profit corporation of Congress, and so it makes us a unique entity. And when we were created in 1971, our purpose was to serve the nation with intercity passenger rail. And so the foundation of Amtrak in its being is to be a social for-profit service for the country. Today we serve 500 communities, and with our expansion plan in the latest Amtrak Connects Us corridor revision and visioning map that we released earlier this year, we're trying to add another 160 communities that are currently underserved or don't have intercity passenger rail service. But with that, from the sustainability side, that's this S side of things, not in its entirety, but one segment of it. From the environmental side, within the sustainability group, we're looking at this as a whole and trying to move the company with a long-standing environmental compliance and sustainability program at the company to get it into different functions and considerations in the way that we take on projects and the way that we scope asset management and project redesign. But then on the governance side, I would say we've been really successful recently in getting greater visibility at the board level and having more regular updates to oversight committees that lead us in our decision making and the programmatic development from climate resilience and sustainability, but then also updating our policies. So we have a lot of work to do. We are an energetic group and certainly take ESG seriously from our side of things and are really excited about all the opportunities that have presented themselves and the shift that's taking place in the company. So that's a quick bit about Amtrak and where we see ESG right now.
Julia, unmute.
I know, I was like, I'm the moderator and yet still muting myself by accident, which is great. Happens to the best of us years later, right? Thank you for sharing that, Kara. And Leslie, I was curious if you would like to share what ESG means in your role.
Sure. I'm the president of Green Century Capital Management, which is the investment advisor to the Green Century funds. And we're a mutual fund company. So that's the easiest way to start thinking about it. We're different. We're owned by nonprofits. So we're owned by groups called the PIRGs. In Pennsylvania, it's called PennPIRG, and their partner group called Environment Pennsylvania. So maybe some of you activists have run into them in different places. So I was thinking about this question in two ways. One, ESG is a set of data points that helps rate companies how they're doing on their environmental, social, and governance risks. And so some investment advisors like ourselves use ESG as part of a way to pick companies. One, and this is a little more complicated, so I'll just mention here, one of the things about ESG is that what it means is how the company is addressing its risks. It's not necessarily how the company is making an impact in the world. And that's a thing that's been lost a lot in the ESG discussion. The other part of, but we use it because it does help us evaluate where the company is in relation to its peers. But what we're really doing with companies also is that we have a advocacy program. It's called shareholder advocacy. And we're using our leverage as shareholders to nudge, push, persuade companies to adopt better environmental policies and practices. And so we work with companies all across the globe on it. And some of the issues that we've worked with and have seen companies as they are looking at their ESG profiles. We've worked on plastic pollution a lot. And so in the last 2 years, we've worked and really pushed Coke to reduce the amount of plastics it uses. And they've now announced that they are both going to reduce their use of new plastics. And last year we got them to announce a first goal that's kind to have at least 25% of all their beverages sold globally be distributed in refillable or returnable plastics or returnable bottles, excuse me. And then we also have worked with a lot of companies to reduce their greenhouse gas goals. And I'd say the newest frontier on that is getting companies to not just look at their direct emissions or the emissions through the electricity that they buy, but the emissions that come through all the products and services in their supply chain, which is called Scope 3 emissions. And we've gotten companies, including Kroger, to announce to set Scope 3 goals. So I'll stop there. But so we think about it in two ways, to, I guess, both on the investment side and then how to work with companies to improve the E in their environmental practices.
Thanks, Leslie. I'm excited to chat more about the investments and kind of the transparency of companies you mentioned too. Mm-hmm. And Brad, how would you like to address ESG and how this relates to your role and much experience?
Well, I decided I'm going to use the a lot today just to annoy you. No, that wouldn't be fun. So I work at a big law firm. The firm is international in scope. We've got like, I don't know, 30 some odd offices. And it's interesting to sort of see it evolve relative to ESG. The things that you and I and others would consider relatively easy to focus on, goal set, and achieve, this is me speaking, this is not the firm, by the way. That's the SEC thing. So they haven't focused on. The things that others haven't focused on that are kind of the hard things in ESG, they have focused on. So it's kind of fascinating to sort of see the conversation evolve. They're smart folks for the most part, for the all part. And they're good people. And so they're open-minded to the conversation. But where they've focused unintentionally, but it's becoming more intentional, is on the S and the G, which is most people haven't gotten there yet. They haven't gotten to the E part for all intents and purposes. Now they would debate that. So this is all amongst us friends, of course. But on kind of water waste, energy, materials, air quality, sure, they're kind of looking at that because of COVID, but for the most part, there's not a lot of goal setting around, what are we doing by way of, individuals in the office, styrofoam cups, that kind of stuff, which is relatively easy. You just need to be intentional about it. We haven't gotten there yet. So, that's been picking up over the last year and a half, 2 years, and will continue and start to really, gain steam. Where they have done some interesting things, Jules, is, again, without sort of thinking about it in the context of the ESG lens and kind of a ratings, they were just doing it because they thought it was the right thing to do relative to the social side. So we have and have for 2 decades a very robust women's initiative. We've got a very robust group of learning groups that are internal lawyers and staff on sort of Black and Latino and disabilities groups. We have a very large LGBTQ plus group that meets often and talks about issues not only within their group, but exterior to the firm. How are they making change relative to the groups making change relative to the management of the firm? And the firm is very focused on making sure that there are not only safe spaces, but the firm is paying attention to issues that are germane to each of the groups. And the management is, they've already set kind of a succession plan relative to making sure that the board is well represented by all of the groups, not only at the senior level, but throughout the ranks of the firm. And so it's just been fascinating to sort of see it from the inside out, having kind of been playing in this pond for 15, 20 years. A company, a firm that the easy stuff they haven't really focused on and the harder stuff they have. So interesting to see that. I've also been fascinated by the firm waking up to the interconnection on the E and the S and the G pieces, the environmental, the social, and the governance pieces. because, again, it's a little bit like the movie The Matrix. You don't see it until you see it, and then you see it everywhere. Folks at the firm are starting to see ESG everywhere, irrespective of if they're a D or an R, irrespective of if they're into energy efficiency or not. They're seeing it in places that they go to consume information. And so, the Wall Street Journal, not exactly the bastion of ESG, there's an article every day in the journal. If you know kind of where to look for it, it's not, it's not headed ESG, but there's stuff there that's reporting on ESG features. And so again, people are starting to become less anesthetized to it and more focused on, okay, can we do things more efficiently, better, represent more folks in that conversation and have a better impact on the environment? And so it's evolving because clients are pushing it. It's evolving because people are becoming more evolved. And it's evolving, frankly, because, folks your age are becoming sort of a little bit older and more in a position to write checks relative to running organizations. And so, Gen X and Gen Y are more than kind of the geezers like me. And you guys are asking the right questions, which is like, what the hell are you guys doing? So that's important.
Thanks for sharing that, Brad. I'm excited to dive in more with all of your expertise too. I wanted to throw a question back to Kara, because I know you're talking about sustainability at Amtrak. And I'm curious what that looks like on a day-to-day basis, from the insider's perspective. What kind of, how does your work look? And what are you focusing on in your position?
Right now, we are getting ready to go into a new fiscal year, which opens up a new budget season for us, which is great. The work that we've been doing, I would say within our group, we have 3 arms to it, where our team, because we are 3 people, are able to focus and specialize in these areas. I have an employee that focuses on our greenhouse gas emissions and our full carbon accounting. She's been doing that for a number of years, and she is looking at much more ambitious targets and full decarbonization plans for the company and what that would entail and the timing around that and how long it would take for Amtrak to actually accomplish something like that. We are a very diesel heavy operation. Everything off of the Northeast corridor are diesel locomotives, and we operate those on other railroad agencies. So BNSF, Norfolk Southern, CSX, other state partners, they own that rail infrastructure and we operate on it. Between Boston and Washington, D.C., we own the majority of that infrastructure, and that is fully electrified. So within my work, I'm leading our climate resilience efforts. And we have a third person who is working on our communications and our reporting. So it's EcoVadis season and CDP season, and I'm throwing out all of these acronyms, but for people that aren't familiar with that, these are reporting frameworks that companies can share quantitatively and qualitatively what they're doing around a specific set of data points. And we find that to be a really good exercise, especially CDP, because it helps us disclose information consistently year over year. So internally, we're able to make connections with different departments. And it might be the team that's responsible for designing and maintaining our tunnels. And as you can imagine, with climate change, we are seeing greater inundation and chronic flooding areas. And having those conversations in the 5 years that I've worked here, to be able to take them from a place where that vernacular and that language was so uncommon to being able to have people raise specific questions to our team on decarbonization and on climate change is really exciting to see, because there is progression that's happening in the literacy and the awareness and even the work experience in the talent that we're hiring, but also the people that are working here, because they're being surrounded by, like what Brad said, content that's outside of their workplace, and they're seeing it in their news feeds and at barbecues when they're chatting with their friends about these things. So from the climate resilience side, very specifically, we led a climate resilient or a climate vulnerability assessment for the Northeast corridor, because as I mentioned, that is our infrastructure that we have the greatest control over. So we figured that would be a good boundary for us to explore what climate trends and threats we are most vulnerable to, and then the level of exposure that each of those asset types have to wind, heavy precipitation, high heat temperatures, and then also storm surge and sea level rise. And for those of you that have ridden along the Northeast Corridor, the views along the Chesapeake are stunning on your way down to Washington, D.C. and between New York and Boston along the Connecticut coastline, when you can see the people on the beach and wave to them. It's beautiful, but there's a very real risk there. And we as a company need to maintain safe, reliable service, and climate change is really pushing up against that. So my work looks like always exploring what teams are doing when they are scoping out a project, when they're faced with an inundation issue. There's a spot in north of Washington, D.C., for example, and this came up in our vulnerability study, where we're trying to get the teams that are working in the field to be able to communicate up the root cause of some of these issues so that we can capture that in the way that we evaluate our train service and our schedules, and then be able to try to find a solution to help prevent that from interrupting Amtrak service, so that you as a customer aren't frustrated when your train isn't running on time, or if the trains are canceled because there's an impact to our infrastructure. So between that and hiring climate experts to help us model what the future projections are going to be, and understanding what climate scenario the company is going to put their stake in the ground and say, this is the year and the RCP that we're going to work towards, and we're going to start planning our schedules and our production so that our maintenance crews can go out and maintain our infrastructure. It's super interconnected, and I may have gone way too technical, and I apologize for that. I'm really, really excited about this work. I think there's a ton of momentum and interest and intelligence behind it. And I'll stop there and take a breath.
I love it. I also enjoyed how you were talking about the specific scenes on going down to Washington and Connecticut and all these other great places. That's a fun part of being on the train, right?
Yeah.
I know also you were just talking specifically about risks, including like flooding and heat and these other environmental concerns. And I know yesterday there was flooding on the Schuylkill. People in the audience were watching or saw the news clips or video clips of cars literally being flooded on I-76, with the heavy rains we had. So I was curious if, the infrastructure specifically in the greater Philadelphia region, if that's something that is threatened by climate change, or if you have specifics around that too.
Yeah. The IDA 1-year anniversary is either now or close to now, and we had 676 as a total bathtub in Philadelphia and people diving into it. But that's a comment for another time. The challenges that we will likely face in Philadelphia, we are, I'll give you a specific example. So in Philadelphia, we have the electrified network. So we have to maintain all of our signals and all of the infrastructure. We also have 30th Street Station that has tracks that are below grade. We're looking at riverine flooding because that's different than coastal. But because we have so many rivers that are in our proximity and so much impervious surface, we know that that water doesn't always have a place to go. And we're planning on new big projects that are going to take place in what we call Pencoach Yard. So if you ever look down into kind of the guts of the rail yard when you're pulling in on one of our trains, that is what we call Pencoach Yard at 30th Street Station. And with some of the new fleet investments that we're making for new train sets that you'll be riding on in a couple of years, we have to have modifications to our buildings. And so being able to understand what the decadal changes are supposed to be or going to be or could be in Philadelphia for riverine flooding, and especially for heat, with heat island effect, and also just seeing that the east is getting hotter. I mean, Southwest and the South are its own situation, but those are some of the risks that we're facing. And it's not just flooding, it's also If we look at heat, if any of you rode our trains in July, you could probably tell that the trains were traveling slower than what they are scheduled to. And that's because our catenary, the power lines that hang overhead, have certain operational thresholds, and the lines sag when it gets really, really hot. And the rails get really, really hot from sun exposure. And so we have to, for safety measures, roll at slower speeds. But that affects our train schedules, and then affects your convenience as a customer. So again, it's all interconnected, and having conversations with engineers is just as important as having conversations with marketing and revenue.
Great, thanks for sharing that intel or insight on that. Brad, I know before our official call, you were also talking about how you built the ESG strategy at Brandywine Real Estate. And I was curious how, you took on that mission, or really like how those conversations were to put together something regarding ESG and your experience with that.
It's a good question. So throw me for a loop here. So it was a long time ago. I have to go back to deep recesses of my brain, which is, addled as I get older. All the stuff that you're dealing with your parents on, which is like, I walk into the kitchen and I can't remember why I'm there. That's all going on. So now you're asking to go back 15 years. It was a group effort. Our CEO was asking the question because, he was curious, reading an article, and he's an inquisitive individual and well-read, and started to ask about like, well, what is this sustainability thing, and why should we be involved, or why shouldn't we be involved? And that thread kind of started a collection of people across the company talking about, well, we own 300 buildings. We have millions of square feet of space. People are coming into that space, pre-pandemic, of course. We're coming into that space every day, thousands of people. So should we be thinking about things a little bit differently? How are we building these buildings? What materials are going into the buildings? How much energy are we using in the buildings? What kind of water impact do we have? What kind of waste impact do we have? So it was kind of internal on what are we doing for our employees and how are we acting that way? It was external. What are we doing for our customers that were the tenants? And what were we doing for the people that were coming to help service the building? So landscapers, janitorial, HVAC people, what kind of chemicals were they bringing into the buildings, intentionally, unintentionally? Should we have standards about that? Early on, I was going to say I had hair back then, but I didn't. Scott, who definitely had hair and still does, was kind enough to come and talk to a bunch of our property management folks. And this was long time ago, 15 years ago. It was kind of like the beginning, or folks have been toiling in the fields for a while, but this was relatively new in the real estate world. And so we had an open conversation about hey, this is why it's relevant. It's about saving the world, but it's about tree hugging, but it's not just that. It's being efficient in how we operate. That efficiency will translate to better environmental things. But if you're a tree hugger, great. If you're not, there's economics that support the notion of, hey, we can do things better and more efficiently, consume less, and leave the world a better place for our kids and grandkids. And so that conversation, started Mr. Toad and Miss Toad's wild ride of, okay, what are we doing? What are our competitors doing? What are others doing? People in the public real estate space were starting to pay attention. We then started to kind of chat with each other. So like in business, a lot of people don't share information. In the sustainability world, people are very good sharers. It tends to be because they're female as opposed to male. Females much better at sharing information and collaborating. What a surprise there. And so the very smart people in the sustainability realm were young, smart women who were sort of saying, guys, what the hell are you doing? You're not doing anything. We're going to put you over here. We're going to just go do this and get this done. And so it was interesting to sort of have that conversation across the company, come back with recommendations on, hey, these are what other people are doing. This is what we're doing. Frankly, nothing. And let's do something. And we then started to goal set, and we started to, over time, really achieve some interesting things that became, ingrained in the culture. And they still, to this day, do a lot of really, really good stuff in the sustainability world. And, the REITs, real estate investment trusts, have a whole group that gets together, monthly, quarterly, and talks about what are others doing, what could we be doing, what should we be doing, and Brandywine continues to be a integral part of that, and they continue to share kind of their successes and frankly even what didn't work, so that others don't have to learn by tripping. They can learn by what others have done, and that was the whole purpose of the conversation. So it was interesting to see that. That's what I was saying earlier. When I went to the law firm was still kind of back in the we had a green team, but we're finished. I'm like, no, you're never finished, and there's always something else to do. What do you mean you're finished? There's like styrofoam cups sitting around. What's that about? So there's always something to do. Depends on kind of perspective, but one can always do more, and one can always be more efficient at how they do it. And again, if you're a numbers person, there's plenty of numbers that support this stuff. If you're an environmental kind of social person, less interested in the numbers, that's fine too. There's kind of good to be done, all around the horn on this stuff.
And Brad, I like how you were chatting specifically about how, the conversations often led with the efficiency and really, the non-environmental front, right? Because even thinking of how some people might buy a Tesla because it's a cool status symbol and not necessarily for the environment, but obviously as they're doing that, they're doing something positive. So I was curious because you were talking about your more recent conversations with styrofoam cups. Do you feel like the environmental piece is leading more, or do you think it's still the efficiency, or how has that evolved over that time?
Good question. It depends on who you are and where you are. So not everybody cares about the things you and I and the others care about, which that was a lesson. To me, it was like, well, why wouldn't we care? But there are definitely distinct camps here. There are people that still need to be convinced, if they're open to the conversation, which many are not, that we humans are creating kind of climate change and heat effect, and kind of from what we're doing. So there are people that don't believe that, and there are people kind of even in Philadelphia that don't believe that. So it's depending on where you're at in the United States and in the world. People are very focused on it or not focused at all. Depending on where we are in the state, people are focused or not focused. It tends to have, it's not always a DNR thing, but it can be. Democrat, Republican, and it also depends on kind of a little bit where your livelihood comes from. So I get it why folks who have been, generationally working in the coal mines are focused on coal, but how one approaches that systematically and helps people sort of get past, kind of bad acts. So, and provides an on-ramp to our conversation that's meaningful. That's kind of the key to this whole thing. So it's kind of finding people where they're at and helping them find an appropriate on-ramp. So whether it's efficiency to reduce cost and consumption, or whether it's social impact, I don't care. I care, but I don't care how you get on the ramp, so long as you're, on the ramp and on the sort of crawling, walking, running kind of thing, because there's so much that we all have to do to sort of make a meaningful traction in what we're talking about, that there's so much to do. And so it's almost like, every day is relevant and every kind of conversation is important. But you can't be here 24/7 or you kind of lose your mind a little bit.
Yeah. I also love the references to I don't care how you get on the track as long as you're there, because, if we think about it, so many people have common interests. It may not be the sustainability chat, right? But if you're talking to someone about what they care about, right? Maybe it's they are outdoors, they like fishing, they care about natural resources. There's so many ways to engage people, both in these climate conversations and greater things that still achieve the same end goal. So it's great to hear that echoed too.
Yeah, I was struggling to go with the train has not left the station and to keep the train thematic going, but you're with me.
We'll keep it up because Kara's on here. We're talking with Amtrak. It's all good.
Exactly.
And Leslie, I do want to dive in, because I know in your intro too, you're really talking about how ESG might be a measure that companies are measuring, but it may not mean that they are necessarily good for the environment or they're making a big impact. And I also teased earlier, I love the line how you've been quoted talking about greenwashing. So I was just curious, in your perspective, how you're thinking of these concepts, both of how companies are making progress, but also understanding that line between greenwashing. So how does that all fit into your perspective?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's two types of greenwashing that are happening. One is at the company level and one is at the investment level. We spent, and I won't talk, the investment level, there's like, you know, every firm now has pictures of pretty trees and nature, and, you know, they may not be doing anything necessarily to protect the environment, but they figured out that's what sells, because firms like us who've been around like 30 years, you know, have created more of this movement, and now Main Street, Wall Street has picked it up. There's a huge variety and difference between the companies we work with, who sometimes have, for example, like no greenhouse goal emissions at all. And you talk to them, like one of them is Hanes Celestial, the company out in Colorado that makes the celestial teas that people may have seen or drink. And we were really surprised. And we went to them, and you never know when you approach a company what their reaction will be. And so we were ready to you know, have a really hard knock conversation with them, and if need be, file a shareholder resolution, which is one of the tools you can use as shareholder advocates, and that shows up on their annual proxy, and everyone votes on it. And companies generally do not like having outside shareholder resolutions at all. And instead, when we had a meeting with them, they were really, really open and said, you're right, we probably should have these. And we went back and said, okay, well, here's the sort of gold standard. You should have the science-based targets approved by an entity. It's called the Science-Based Target Initiatives, or SBTI. And they did it. And so that's an example of a company that just, you know, maybe their culture was open to it, or maybe who knows exactly why they did it. But again, they did get on board with it, and they did it. And then there's other companies who, a big box retailer that we have tried to work with to install more solar on their rooftops, is just very, very clear. They are not going to be pushed by their consumers, by their investors, by anyone else. They're going to do it state by state, region by region, where it is cheaper for them to do rooftop solar than beyond the grid. And then that's it. And so that conversation kind of goes nowhere. And then there's others where we think there's more hope, and we spend a year or two working with them, and sometimes do have to bring a question to the proxy ballot. And those are not binding questions like with an election. So when we got a 70% vote at Costco to set up greenhouse gas emissions, it didn't then require them to do it, but it gave us a lot more leverage when we went and met with them this spring, that, you know, it's not just us at Green Century or a few other, you know, environmental mutual fund companies, but, you know, to get 70%, either State Street, BlackRock, or Vanguard needs to vote with you, not exactly bastions of, you know, environmental activism. And so that sent a signal, and they have made some progress this spring. So how they represent it, usually their impact reports, getting back to your greenwashing, the impact reports are not of that much value because they can pick and choose what they put out. The CDP reporting, which Kara mentioned and Brad gave the full name for, is really helpful as some of the measurable metrics. But a lot of the companies have figured out that there is a demand for them to look more sustainable, and so have answered that with impact reports, which again are a little, you know, pick and choose what you want to highlight, and it's not universal. It's really hard to compare company to company from those, so we usually have to do a lot more of our own research to figure out what's going on.
Thanks for sharing that.
I mean, I guess in one like more automotive kind of thing, you always have to look under the hood to see what's happening at a company, as well as with investments. You can't just go by the name of anything or what it's called, or you really have to look at the details.
Yeah, is there, I guess, is the best resource for consumers to look at something like CDP, or is there any other websites that assess these different investments?
On the investment side, there are a few places. It depends what you're looking for. We're a fossil fuel free firm. And so you can also like Google fossil fuel free firms and then make sure to read the prospectus, which is the legal document governing the funds. We also have a guide to fossil fuel free investing and sort of a shameless plug. Okay, here's my dog. In a shameless plug, that's the noise in the background, sorry. The at greencentury.com, you can download it and get it if you give us your email, I think. Or you can email me after this and I'll send it to you. I'm at LC, I'll put it in the chat. So that can help you get started. There's also something called USSIF, USSIF, and that is more of a big macro self-reported list of different investment firms and funds. And I think it depends what you're looking at. A lot of people don't, just put money in their 401k and they probably don't have a sustainable option. But if you're doing an IRA or doing your own just investing, you can just contact us or look at those resources. And if you have a financial advisor, they should definitely be able to find options for you. And if they can't or won't, you might want to find I'm kind of cutting to the chase, but you might want to find a new financial advisor because there are plenty of options out there to meet your criteria.
Yeah, that's a great point. I remember calling my mutual fund manager like 5 years ago and being like, I want to invest in sustainable things. They're like, it's a bad decision. It's not going to get you much of a return. I was like, but I don't think you understand my question.
That's so frustrating. That's such a common refrain. And so first of all, you might even be willing to take less, you're like, but even if that is not what you're willing to do, there's plenty of options. And people usually say that because the advisors don't know all the facts and aren't comfortable recommending anything. So they just sort of steer you in the opposite direction. But there's advisors in the Philly area that we work with, as well as all in the Eastern Corridor, because that seems to be a theme here, that specialize in it and are really great.
So just, Jules, if I could pick up on that. So again, not to politicize this, but it's almost like impossible. Which I'm happy to politicize it, frankly, but we'll try to keep it above board for a second. The Florida, West Virginia, and Texas, just so we're aware, again, the attorney generals from each of those 3 states have banded, kind of together, and there's like 8 others that you could guess, but they haven't done anything yet. Each of those states has now put forth legislation that says that in connection with state dollars that are being invested, they are not permitted to take into account ESG features in their investing. Like, not permitted. So again, there's a whole conversation around that, which again is a little bit more than today. But that's just, that's what a bunch of us are kind of involved with and fighting relative to mindset on, from that side of the ledger. It's supposed to be capitalistic. It's just about the shareholder return, which is where people were for 300 years, but where things have been modulating away from over the last 10, 15 years as stakeholders, not shareholders. Shareholders would be one group, but others that you affect, employees, suppliers, community, are taken into account in connection with investment decisions. Which I'm, again, Leslie could talk, I'm sure, off the top of her head at 2 a.m. on this if we wake her up. And so it's that conversation that is relevant. And like everybody knows, voting is relevant. When we go and we vote and we get kind of elected officials that have a particular point of view, it's relevant. And so that happening is unfortunate and will set us back, despite kind of Leslie and others' incredible efforts. There is a massive wall of money that has been investing in ESG type investments, over the last decade, in particular over the last 5 years. And so if you look at kind of just round numbers like green bonds. 10 years ago, we're kind of a bunch of us geeks kind of in a corner, talking about stuff. Well, between, I think it was 2020, there was like $3.4 billion of investment in green bonds internationally, which isn't that much, but that's, from zero. That's 3.4 billion in 2020. Well, in 2021, that number went from 3.5 billion to like 49.7 billion. That's a massive uptake in money that's looking for a home, that's interested in the features that Leslie and others we were talking about, that cares. They want to hear about these features. They may care about different features, but they're very interested in the ESG underpinning relative to performance. And there are hundreds, I don't mean one or two, hundreds of studies that show that ESG focused investment do better than non-ESG. People don't like to poo-poo that, but there are a massive amount of studies out there, if you're interested in it, that support the notion that caring more than just about profit enriches your return. Put aside socially, it does, but enriches your economic return. So again, a longer chat, but it's unfortunate that that's happening, but it's happening. And that's kind of a little bit of, who's in office and, belief system a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great point. I also put in the chat, voting in the midterms is so important, which is coming up too.
Yeah.
Right, I'm not allowed to say that ESG investing increases performance because of our compliance, but Brad said it. So, but also, fossil fuel free investing, except for this last year, over the last 10 years, it was the worst performing sector in a decade. It's really volatile. It's just, some of it is value alignment, but there are some potential. That's the word I've learned to say a lot too, since I've been at Green Century. So like there's potential better returns. So I know I've gotten a few messages like, if your advisor is not helping you, you deserve to have one that actually works for you and what you want to do. Again, so I can send you some resources and send them to Julie, or send some names of Philly people that I can't recommend anyone, but I can send you some names and you could talk to them and find one that you might like.
I love it. It's also similar kind of how people are like, the money in solar or whatever else. And you see like that has like twice the number of jobs in the growing sphere that way, of just like how that's taking off compared to how the conversation was even 5 or 10 years ago. I do want to get to attendee questions, but I want to have one rapid fire because it's such a good conversation of one way your company or a company you're working with, whatever, is approaching a cool environmental challenge, or just something that you're seeing that's giving you hope with all this other climate challenges that we have in the sphere, political challenges that Brad just mentioned that we could talk about for hours on end too. But what's one thing each of you are optimistic about or working on?
Kira, do you want to go first?
That's such a long list that's building. I'll go last.
I would say it's a tie between fossil fuel free investing, which has fueled the growth of Green Century a lot, and we've gotten agreements with 12 companies on plastic reduction, from big ones like Coke to Mattel to Target. And, we're $1 billion fund, but we're not, State Street or something. And for us to get those agreements in the last 2 years, I'm really hopeful. Plastics, which is essentially fossil fuels, need to go away, and that the companies are responding to us and others is hopeful.
Love it.
I've got 3.5. I'll try to truncate it quickly. So I'm working on a really cool project. Again, these things are like long in gestation because they're, big projects. So they're each super cool, and I get all fired up about it. So I'll keep it short, or try to. So one group is working on a project to take wood scraps and paper compress it into pellets, which isn't novel, but to use the pellets to make renewable diesel fuel. So diesel is not good in and of itself, but the big oil companies are being pressed by various states, including California, to use renewable diesel in their fuel supply. And so the ability to use these wood scraps, which would have otherwise gone to a landfill, create a fuel source, create then renewable diesel out of the wood is kind of curious to me. That company, you know, they want to build one of these things as a test case. It's like $150 million, but they have supply contracts or, you know, requirements contracts with big oil to buy as much as they can produce. So they could do 10 of those. We're talking like $1 billion of renewable diesel, which is much better than pulling the diesel out of the ground. That's kind of one. I had one deal that has died but may resurrect itself because of the recent infrastructure bill, not the 1.2 billion one, but the Inflation Reduction Act. So there's a whole other conversation beyond today on solar panels and why we don't have any manufacturing in the United States and slave labor in China, all kind of interrelated. One of my folks was focusing on building essentially a plant to make solar panels in the United States. Would be kind of the first one in a long time. There was a bunch of companies that went out of business, Solyndra being the most famous one. So that it's like $1.5 billion to create this manufacturing operation using locally sourced jobs, which in this where they were looking at it would be mostly folks of color. I got stumbling here. Folks of color to work in the factory. The last one is separate but similar. Folks are using, they're working on a factory. It's about $75 million. They're going to replicate it into about 20 of these things to take used sugarcane. So like kind of waste from sugarcane, create a large biodigester, which folks may be familiar with, essentially digest that sugarcane and create fuel from the sugarcane waste. Typically that stuff gets just tossed into a landfill and sits there and, you know, creates methane over a long period of time. So the ability to reuse the sugarcane is pretty cool. And they're going to create a fuel source. Again, that fuel, they have, you know, people that would buy that for the next 20 years. And so, you know, people are starting to be really creative at, you know, kind of utilizing waste in order to create energy. That energy would not need to come from the earth and therefore would be fossil fuel free mostly. But again, you got to, you know, kind of peel back the onion a little bit to make sure that, you know, those, you know, the processes are correct. So those three things are getting me a little fired up.
And Kara, are you ready for your?
Yes, I would say that I am really excited about the fleet development that we have right now. We have an RFP that's being constructed for a hydrogen locomotive. And then we also have another request for proposal. And then we have a request for information on what the market and locomotive manufacturers have for battery solutions. So that would change our powertrains entirely. And also, Brad, we're investigating renewable diesel for our fuel supplies for the near-term solution, not as a long-term solution.
Nice.
And I'm ready for us to take on questions because I see a lot of them are focused on Amtrak, and I'm prepared to talk about it.
Great. Well, thanks. I was going to say, it's so great to hear from all of the panelists today. So thank you for sharing such insightful info. If anyone would like to ask a question directly, I know the chat has had a few. You can raise your virtual hand and I will unmute you for questions directly to the panelists.
Can I just jump in on the question about 30th Street?
Yes, and Kara, if you just want to address those virtual questions, go for it.
Yeah, this situation keeps me up at night, and I am working really hard to figure out how to influence the company as much as I possibly can. And I hear all of your concerns, I acknowledge them, and they are completely valid. And they're all things that I have raised within the company and that we are working through. So what I can tell you right now is that we are, as a company, truly committed to sustainability. And it might not always look like that in every decision that we make. This particular situation, we are conducting an environmental analysis to be able to baseline where we are today and then where we will be when the renovations are complete with the plenary group. We have heard from various stakeholder groups. We hear you, we understand the concerns that you want to be able to share, and we will have one of our colleagues will be setting up listening sessions with specific stakeholder groups in order to hear directly from you. Our communities are really important to us, the ones that neighbor us and Philadelphia in general. We'll also be meeting with council people in order to hear their concerns about this. And I would also say that we are conducting a technology analysis in order to be able to see what is non-fossil fuel based as an alternative to the natural gas boilers that were proposed. So I am diligently working on this, and I hope that you can trust me when I say that. I've been learning a lot about the situation, and I'm glad that you're raising this, and I really appreciate the community's voice in this. And Elaine, I see your hand raised, and I remember seeing an email that came in that was passed around the company from you. So it's good to see you on this call.
Elaine, I'll mute you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for that information. I've been trying to figure out what's going on with this assessment, which was described by one of your colleagues, Mr. Dennis Newman, in the Philadelphia Inquirer in response to some articles and letters to the editors. And I've called and written a number of times to try to find out what is the time frame for this assessment and when might we expect to be involved, consulted, asked, or informed about it.
Sure.
That's one question. And the other question is, can you assure us, I hope so, that while this is going on, plans for the gas-fired boilers will not be going forward?
I cannot commit to anything right now. What I can answer for you is that what I've seen is that it could be a 3 to 6 month assessment period. We had to release a change order request as part of the plenary infrastructure group that is the developer for 30th Street Station. They're the ones that are doing all of the work on behalf of Amtrak. So they're the ones that are conducting the analysis, and they proposed to us that it would be 3 to 6 months. And the plans to have listening sessions, I would anticipate that will be coming up shortly, like within this season, September, October, I'm not sure. We're still making sure that everyone is on the same messaging platform.
But just to clarify, you're saying that while this is going on, the
project is continuing. 30th Street Station Master Development Project is happening. So this project was kicked off in 2018 or 2019. This specific element of the redevelopment was agreed upon and was decided upon before my involvement. So I am working diligently to collaborate with the 30th Street Station team and to find a solution that allows us to be able to meet our GHG goals and to uphold the values that we have as a company. So that is what I can commit to right now. I wish I could say more. No, the boilers have not already been installed. They're just designed.
Well, thanks for your very transparent honesty, Kara. I appreciate that as well from your perspective. I was curious if anyone else had questions for the other panelists. I know Leslie had to jump to another call, but if anything for Brad or any other quick last minute questions from the audience. I know we're a little bit over time. Raise your virtual hand if so. And with that, I was going to say, no, we ran a few minutes over. So thank you everyone for listening, your engaging conversation on the chat. This is a great conversation, both to hear from each of the panelists. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. We will follow up with an email that will give the resources links that the panelists mentioned, as well as a survey. So please make sure to fill that out. And thank you, Kara, Brad, Leslie, and she had to jump. And we really appreciate your time today and sharing your expertise. So round of applause.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks for having us, Jules.
Thanks. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
You too. Bye-bye.
Yeah.